Before I start this program of today's session that's going on here in the United States, worldwide, we here at the Windmill Ministries have some comments that we'd like to issue out to the general public pertaining to seeing what we're seeing on TV here in America. There's a purpose, the reason why that the military chose to issue out Purple Hearts to those who was wounded in combat. And of course, we understand now that there's different ways that people can become wounded. You can not only become wounded physically, but you can become wounded emotionally. Some of the deepest scars that can't be healed other than through time and prayer is those emotional scars. The reason why the military chose purple was because the color of your blood is actually blue before it gets absorbed into the oxygen that flash drives it all over into red. But between the two, between the purple and the red, you have purple. Kind of like a bruise. Whenever you get bruised real bad, ordinarily the bruise is either bluish or purplish color. Sometimes it's red, but ordinarily it's purple. The Purple Heart that the Windmill Ministries sunk a great deal of time and energy into towards planting it out here on this property was put there not for entertainment purposes. It was put there for a deep, substantial statement that we was making, not only to our military, but the hurting that our Heavenly Father is right now going through towards watching these types of immoral acts happen all over America. That has, yes, been predicted by the founder of the Windmill Ministries. The resolution is clear. We, as not only Americans, but as a Homo sapien race, must go back and do thy first works over again, just as the 4 chapters of Revelation speaks of. To go back in doing that in which what we know that Christ has required for us to do. And if we do not do that, we will see things escalate and evolve on a level such as man has never seen before. There was only one other time this year that the type of violence that you're fixing to see escalated, and that was right after the death of George Floyd. Now we're seeing it in an issue of occurrences that is happening all over this country that, as far as we are concerned, has been hijacked by a bunch of anarchists and a bunch of cruel, insensitive, mean-spirited barbarians that want to drive society off into a state of no return. Once more, that heart that we placed out here bleeds purple for the insults and the damage and the carnage that we have seen on TV just as recently within the past few minutes. Please listen and watch this. And we want to warn our viewers before watching this that this is not a game. This is not a video game. And if you can't handle what you're fixing to see, we strongly advise for you not to watch it. Because it's inappropriate to child behavior. It's inappropriate to a civilized society behavior. It's inappropriate to God and to God's kingdom pertaining to watching this type of violence be unleashed right here in America. The images that you're going to see, some of them are graphic. The images that you're going to hear about, some of them are graphic. So please, prepare yourselves for this.
Blaring horn to white supremacists and racists. And then you had Tom Cotton, and he's tried to push back on this, but the guy went to Harvard Law School. He knows how to draft a sentence, and this is what Tom Cotton wrote. As the Founding Fathers said, slavery was the necessary evil upon which the Union was built. We'll let Tom Cotton try to clean that up.
Why would anybody with his type of education, his type of influence, and his type of stance that he has presently with the world have written out such of a letter in this degree, in this form? It's still beyond me. This goes beyond the lesser of the two evils of making a statement such as this, because it was never intended for the Union to form under the pretense of slavery. And why he would have said this is mind-boggling to me. It just shows you how screwed up that some people's minds are in issuing out letters like this of people that are twisted, mangled, and obviously don't interpret things properly, and they want to issue out this propaganda to the rest of the world, hoping that they'll become just as deceived as what this guy is. It's sickening. It's heartbreaking to see someone on this level that would be willing to promote such of an ideal like this. Because the way that I understand the Union is that it was never approached in the degree of bringing in slavery for the benefit of the Union. If anything, it was just the opposite of knowing that slavery was wrong and that a free, open, fair society, a democracy, could never be entrenched or impinged upon others by force or by unwill, simply because they was the bigger or the stronger of the bully. It's time for the war hogs to come out. It's time to bring peace to these situations that we know are being stirred up by the Antichrist spirit himself of lashing out, just as the Bible talks about lashing out, because he realizes and has identified that his time is short here upon this planet. It is time for the war hogs to come out and explain, this is not how we're going to end the scene. The way that we're going to end the scene is the way that the scene has already been projected and predicted in the Bible for the scene to end. And before God comes back in great wrath with a reward for his saints, but wrath for the ungodly, there will be, I'm going to repeat it one more time, there will be a great revival that will fall upon to this planet, and we will see it re-revolutionize society in these last days. Please watch the rest of this, because it is so disheartening in waking up Monday morning after me spending a good weekend down in Pickwick, Tennessee, being involved with the brothers down there, having a conference meeting, to the point of coming back Monday morning, turning on the news, being away from the news, being away from the media temporarily for about 48 hours, and then I come back and this is what I have to embark upon. Please, 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 if you are a sensitive person in these matters, you may want to forfeit watching this particular program.
Up over the next several days, we all can read English, and he tried blaming that on the media. He should blame it on himself or whoever drafted that. But Rev, these sort of quotes not only damage Donald Trump and Republican senators with black voters, with Latino voters, with Asian American voters. It, of course, damages Donald Trump's prospects of ever winning back white suburban voters in the suburbs of Philly, in the I-4 corridor, in Macomb County, Michigan, in the suburbs of Milwaukee, the suburbs of Pittsburgh. This blatant racism is devastating and self-defeating, not only to Donald Trump's election chances, but also to a lot of these Republican senators in Arizona and North Carolina.
Well, what you're saying is critical in terms of dealing with the political climate. There are those in the suburbs, there are those in the white community that will say, well, I'm a little more conservative in terms of how we deal with government spending, or I'm a little more conservative in how we deal with criminal justice issues. But I'm not prepared to say because my friend or my neighbor's a Democrat, they hate white people. And even more alarming, I'm clearly not going to identify with saying that enslaving human beings, making them 3/5 of a man, making their life's duty to serve me with no wages is a necessary evil. That's a bridge too far for many people in the white conservative community. Forget those of us that are appalled and outraged because you're talking about us. You're asking people who live lives every day trying to raise their families, who are more conservative, but they believe in this country, to say it is necessary that we enslaved people and treated them as barbarians to build this country, and we want you to go and co-sign that in the voting booth. That's what Tom Cotton is saying. And you want people to say that people at the work site with me that happen to be Democrat, happen to have a different party, a different political view to me, really just hate white people. That's what people are not prepared to co-sign that. I think it's a tremendous moral outrage, and I think it's a even more tremendous political miscalculation on suburban and Republican and conservative whites.
Now that man right there just said a mouthful. He just said a mouthful, and I agree with what he's saying. And he's not trying to stir up tension. He's not trying to stir up discord. He's not trying to stir up misguided and bad behavior. He's telling the truth. And I want to throw this into my viewers before we get into the rest of this. There is a possibility during the rule of King George IV, because of the Europeans' way of thinking back hundreds of years ago, that in the year 1619, there may have been some idiot out there who actually promulgated this type of concept of believing in this ideal. Because back then, they was twisted. They was messed up. You keep in mind that these are the same people that come over here in boatloads that didn't just want to colonize the red man. They didn't want to just reconform the red man. They wanted to exterminate the red man. They wanted to eradicate the red man. So these people's thinking during the 615 and the 1600s was already messed up. We know that. We know that they was tremendously messed up people because they wasn't trying to get along with the red man over here. They wanted to desecrate the red man. So whenever you're dealing with such of a sick society that come over the waters, the European sick society, it's a possibility that somebody in there quoted somebody by saying this. But not of the Union, the real Union, because the real Union didn't become the Union until 1776. It wasn't until George Washington stood up and fumigated his spies to be able to resist that movement that they know was a evil, demonic, dark movement during the 16 and the early 1700s. That's the reason why the people here in America decided to say, enough is enough. And they had an uprising. And it wasn't just over the taxation of tea. It was the whole concept of what they was trying to do to the American people over here. And the proof is in the pudding towards what they done to the Indians. That actually brainwashed some of the good people over here, like Jackson, President Jackson, of bringing that much more oppression to the Native Americans. That was a deep, dark, demonic force that come over the waters that wanted to bring this type of humiliation to humanity. And people need to recognize that. That come over here that wanted to entangle and brainwash these people's way of thinking towards how that they treated each other and how that they was getting along to begin with. Sure, they may have had a skirmish every now and then, pretending to one Indian tribe bases another Indian tribe, but they wasn't steadily at one another's throats. They wasn't trying to eradicate each other. They was getting along. They knew how to grow crops. They knew how to hunt. They knew how to be obedient in the kindness of each other towards one hand washes the other. It was the Europeans that come over here with their concept that we're going to show them how to eat the cabbage, and it was only because of gunpowder that they even come close of eradicating the red man, because the red man had not yet been introduced to that same depression or that same entity pertaining to gunpowder, and that's the only reason why the Europeans done what they done in scarring and marring the Indian civilization over here in America. And we know that. And we know that. But whenever you go back to claims that was said and done during the 1600s, the 1700s, going back to 1619 project, this was the old European concepts. This had nothing to do with the State of the Union that was formed in 1776. So by that senator getting up there saying that, he took things out of context. He doesn't know his proper history.
Protests over racial justice turned violent over the weekend, fueled in large part by the anger over federal forces being deployed to Portland. Thousands protested across the country, up and down the West Coast, in Louisville, Kentucky, in Texas. Riots.
Look at this. Seattle, Oakland, Louisville, Portland, Denver, Los Angeles. An outbreak of nothing but hostility and violence this weekend while I was down in the meeting with the brothers discussing the Bible and discussing other things in regards towards what has turned this country upside down to begin with. You can blame it on the coronavirus if you want to, but the bottom line is this: we was already heading down a deep, dark chamber before the coronavirus ever hit. You know, you can kick the can down the road just for a certain amount of times before you're going to have to deal with the problem. You can put rubber stamps and band-aids on stuff and hope that the problem goes away. But until you actually address the problem is not going to go away. And from what I can see, from my perspective, all this violence is not the proper way of solving these problems. And violence has never been the proper way of solving problems. There has to be compromise. And there has to be people to sit down at the table to figure out new methods and new concepts for we the people. You have to do things in a practical, civilized way, and to get out and to beat one another's head in is not the civilized, practical way of doing it. Please watch this and be careful if you're sensitive towards watching these types of atmospheres.
Were declared in both Seattle and Portland on Saturday. Seattle police say 45 people were arrested and more than 20 officers were injured after being hit with rocks and explosives. Officials say rioters also broke through a fence and set fire to this youth detention center that was under construction. A total of 5 people were shot at protests across the country. Police in Austin say a protester was carrying a rifle, was shot and killed by a motorist during a confrontation with demonstrators. In Aurora, Colorado, police say this SUV was fired at while driving down the interstate toward protesters. Another person in the crowd was also hit. This was the scene in Portland Saturday night, under utter mayhem. The video shows protesters limping away, one of them shot with a rubber bullet after kicking a flashbang back at federal forces. President Trump tweeted about Portland last night, accusing the protesters of being, quote, anarchists who hate our country. Princeton University professor Omar Wasso, who has studied the effect of violence in civil rights campaigns, points out in the Wall Street Journal that protesters could hurt their cause. He said the narrative of which side is creating the violence at protests could impact the election. Quote, if we see growing violent resistance by protesters, that often becomes the justification for more repression by the state. We haven't seen this level of violence among protesters since the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's death at the end of May, and it only came after the president unleashed military-style federal forces on mostly peaceful protesters in Portland.
I don't believe that. I don't believe that for a second, that it only come after. See, once more, they're being biased in the way that they're viewing this type of violence, and once more they're trying to blame it off on the federal government pertaining to this type of violence. Nobody is sticking a gun to nobody's head, making them go out on the streets and become vicious vigilantes out on the streets. These people are doing these things intentionally so that they can hijack this movement. And I guarantee you, it is not the federal government that is hijacking this movement. It is the federal government that is trying to prevent from these anarchists from getting out here and burning and looting and doing what they're doing. So what she just said in her statement, listen to it one more time.
And only...
Back it up. Back it up.
Often becomes the justification for more repression by the state.
Back it up a little more. Get all of it. What she just said, listen to it.
SUV was fired at while driving down the interstate toward protesters.
That SUV was out of control. That SUV was causing reckless endangerment. And that SUV, if I was a police officer at that scene, I would have been wanting to throw out spikes or shot the tires out from underneath that vehicle to control that driver so that that vehicle would have become disabled. You don't take an automobile in the middle of that many people and drive the way that this driver is driving. This driver deserved for his tires to be punctured or something to disable this type of action around these type of people, because as far as I'm concerned, you can take an automobile and turn it into a missile. You can take an automobile and turn it into a gun. You can take an automobile and turn it into a piece of destruction that could kill and lame dozens, if not hundreds of people. We've already seen this in other terrorist type actions, homegrown terrorist type actions in other parts of the world. I think it was over in Germany where the guy took that Bob truck and killed about a dozen people running over people and stuff. So if I was a police officer, I don't know who this guy here is that's doing the shooting right there. I don't know if he's aiming. I don't know if this individual is aiming at the tire. I don't know if this individual is aiming at the windshield. But it's obvious, whoever it is, he's trying to stop this automobile because it's out of control. The driver is attempting terrorist type resistance actions that he needs to be restrained under. But that's not what you hear the commentators say. You hear the commentators say, oh, it's because of the federal troops that's coming out onto the scene. You need to evaluate these situations that you're looking at and don't take it for face value in how that the commentator brings it out to the viewers. Because you have to be able to listen, observe, and use your own common sense values in what is going on and how it's going on and where it's going on to determine what's actually occurring here.
Another person in the crowd was also hit. This was the scene in Portland Saturday night, under utter mayhem. The video shows protesters limping away, one of them shot with a rubber bullet after kicking a...
It shows one of the protesters limping away.
Flashbang back at federal forces. President Trump tweeted about Portland last night, accusing the protesters of being, quote, anarchists who hate our country. Princeton University professor Omar Wasso, who has studied the effect of violence in civil rights campaigns, points out in the Wall Street Journal that protesters could hurt their cause. He said the narrative of which side is creating the violence at protests could impact the election. Quote, if we see growing violent resistance by protesters, that often becomes the justification for more repression by the state. We have...
Well, yeah, that's what's going to happen, to be able to shove it down or to shut it down or to quiet it down, because a true civilized society is not going to allow anarchists to run the streets. If you're a country at all that claims to be a civilized country, you're going to snuff out this type of action, because it is not civilized. And it is not fair for those who do not want to participate in all this violence and all this hostility.
been seen this level of violence among protesters since the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's death at the end of May, and it only came after the president unleashed military.
It only came. Did you hear what she said? It only came after. She's lying. She's taking things out of context right there. Just like whenever she says what she says about one person limping, she tries to emphasize that everybody was limping. We didn't see but one person limping. We know what's going on. The very soul of Satan is uprising throughout all of this towards creating havoc and mayhem. That's in the very opposite direction of peace and utopia. We know the defiance and how the defiance is happening. Looking at it fundamentally, internally, of what is motivating people to do this. There's no doubt that hardship has fallen upon society. But to work it out the way that they're trying to work it out by bringing hostility and violence into the streets of America is not the way to do it. We have to sit down at the table and we have to work out our differences. And if we need to bring extension loans in, if we need to bring in more subsidy checks until things get back up and going again, whatever society needs to do, then society needs to do that for these people if this is what's causing these people to go out here and do all this. There's always a possibility that these people are just using this for an excuse, kind of like what Donald Trump said as far as a bunch of anarchists that just want to purposely get out here and burn and loot and act crazy. You keep in mind, we're dealing with a society that's been already wounded before the coronavirus ever hit, pertaining to the drug abuse. People going around tweaking. You don't stand a chance in not harming your brain if you've been on meth and you've done without sleep for 14, 15, some people 28, 30, 35 days. You don't stand a chance in not doing some sort of irreversible damage to your brain whenever you do these type of drugs. And it doesn't matter if it's meth, or if it's downers, or if it's oxycontins. If you do drugs on this level, it's going to affect people's minds to the point that they are no longer considered normal. And whenever you have this type of abnormality, you're going to have this type of violence. Until we as a society are willing to look at what's actually going on fundamentally, supernaturally in the spirit world, we're not going to be able to identify the problem. Once more, it's evil lashing out because it knows that it has failed according to the Bible. And because it has failed, this is its way of demonstrating great violence or anger, just as the Bible says that Satan will rise up in great wrath, because he knoweth his time is short.
Military-style federal forces on mostly peaceful protesters in Portland.
In mostly peaceful protesters. I'm going to say 95% of what she just said right there is a lie. Because if they're handling themselves and conducting themselves peacefully, there would be no need for the goon squads to be called out. If people are acting appropriately in their protesting, there is no need for the goons to be called out of this type of action.
Only after videos like this one went viral of a Navy veteran being beaten after trying to talk to the agents. The New York Times says its investigation found that federal officers escalated violence in Portland after they arrived on the 4th of July. Here's a clip from the Times report and a warning: it is graphic.
According to a government memo leaked to the Times, these units are insufficiently trained to perform crowd control. But that hasn't stopped them from trying.
It's graphic.
Night after night, videos show these officers emerging from the two federal buildings as protesters draw near.
These are not Hollywood actors. This is the real deal here.
Hundreds of videos reviewed by the Times show that, although protesters were antagonistic, officers often responded with disproportionate force. They blanketed streets with tear gas.
Are you okay?
They struck protesters with batons and used flashbangs, pepper balls, and other less lethal munitions to clear the streets. Their actions often appeared to escalate rather than de-escalate matters, and in some instances they attacked when there was no apparent threat. 11th, protester Donovan Labella was at the federal courthouse when an officer appears to have fired at his head in retaliation for tossing a spent tear gas canister. Labella's mother told local media he suffered skull fractures and needed surgery. Later that night, when field medics sought officers' help for a wounded protester, they were aggressively cleared away.
Aaron, the escalation continues, and there doesn't seem to be any sign of letting up. What are your thoughts?
Well, this actually reminds me, I was actually on the ground
My thoughts are horrifying.
in Ferguson in 2014 when federal troops came to, that suburb of St. Louis, and you saw, armored vehicles and police in riot gear in a suburban neighborhood with neatly manicured lawns. You had tear gas canisters lying in the grass. It was a very surreal scene, and I can tell you that that presence definitely escalated tensions between law enforcement and the mainly peaceful protesters who were trying to raise the issue of police reform that is now at the center of our national reckoning on race. Listen, this is definitely part of a continuum. The involvement of federal law enforcement during the civil rights movement, their clashes with protesters was certainly something that was dramatic and that ratcheted up the stakes there, but actually helped people, including white people, to see, just to kind of conceive for the first time the idea that maybe there was disproportionate treatment by police in communities of color. But what I think is also really interesting about this moment, as was noted in the New York Times in a story that they had in recent days, you have Portland, a city that is overwhelmingly white, being at the center of the Black Lives Matter movement in this moment. And so you do have a lot of white people who are now seeing, to the point in that video, the disproportionate response that law enforcement can give to folks who, again, are trying to raise awareness around the issue of systemic racism. Look, when you have the president, when you have others kind of going back to a racial playbook, that is something that is at odds with where a lot of the country is in this moment around the issue of policing and police reform. His response on the coronavirus, that tone may be changing, but on the dual pandemic, the other part of that being systemic racism, you're seeing that he is in fact doubling down in a moment when the country is more open to talking about police reform and the need for police reform. I mean, look, the WNBA in their opening season weekend had Black Lives Matter painted on the court. That's a sea change from 2016 when not necessarily a lot of the country was on board with the idea of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, and Reverend Al, we are seeing a sea change in a lot of different areas of American life, and we've talked about it here a good bit. You know, the opening game, Major League Baseball, where first of all you have Black Lives Matters being stenciled in on field in many places. In Boston, they have a huge Black Lives Matter sign in center field, which is a good thing. So maybe people don't notice their pitchers and how bad they are. You also have Mike Barnicle. We'll talk about that later. Good Lord. But you had in that opening game the Nationals against the Yankees. Everybody kneeling together, and those are symbolic, but a lot of positive advances. But we look at what's happening in Portland, what happened in Seattle this weekend, what happened in Oakland, and you have the breaking of windows at a courthouse, setting fire to federal buildings, firing guns in crowds, committing acts of violence that most Americans, including myself, think is repugnant. Now, of course, frightening. Donald Trump's use of federal forces is obviously chilling and it's frightening, but two things can be true at the same time. And I just wonder whether we're seeing some of the outside agitators that we saw throughout the beginning of the George Floyd protests, and I'm wondering if any of these actions, if you think any of these actions or something that we should just look away from and not be concerned about, not be concerned about the escalation.
The head of the Portland NAACP had said that we cannot let what started as a legitimate protest around the racism and the anger around George Floyd and the police abuse become now something else and be exploited as a spectacle. There are legitimate forces on the ground in Portland that started this movement and continue. And then there are other forces that are there for different reasons. Some are there because they have a real difference with how policing is going and respond differently. You have mothers there standing as barricades between the feds and demonstrators, and others are just there causing some kind of playing into what would be detrimental to the cause. And I think, you know, when I was looking at the services over the weekend of John Lewis, that's the thing that those that were older than me that helped train my generation, the John Lewises, who the 15-year age difference between all of us, the John Lewises, the Julian Bonds, the Jesse Jacksons, used to tell us that you can't let your anger feed into your enemy's benefit, because what Donald Trump needs right now is to become the law and order person against people that have made people perceive that the nation is out of control. Therefore, we need someone to get control. When you have everyone now saying, as you just cited, Joe, Black Lives Matter in the major cultural events of this country. We've gone from Colin Kaepernick being controversial to everybody being mainstream, taking a knee that you didn't even know could bend down to their knees. Don't get to the 1 yard line and blow winning the game by letting people incite you into throwing the ball at them rather than carry the ball across the goal line.
Well, and Rev, so many Americans have been so moved by the marches in response to the killing, to the murder of George Floyd, that it's moved opinion polls in a way that have not been moved in decades on issues of race in America, and yet you're right. The what's happening in Portland, as the head of the NAACP said there too often, just looks like a spectacle, and you wonder how many people are there protesting George Floyd's death, and how many people are there creating the spectacle.
And I've experienced that in my life where people will do that for outside reasons. These are not the people in Portland. These are not the people in the indigenous community. When Aaron talks about Ferguson, and I was there, I preached the funeral there of Michael Brown and did the rallies there. Those were the people that were angry that lived in Ferguson. But we're talking here about people that are not from Portland, and that I'm talking about some of the people. The people from Portland have taken a position, the young activists there, and they've been doing this for 59 or more days. We're talking about in the last several days, they should not distort the message. This is about policing, this is about racism. This is not about whether we want to tear something down. It's about we want to build something up, and they cannot be allowed to get in the way of the message, because then they become just as adversarial to the cause as those we're fighting.
And Aaron, I'm so glad you brought up Ferguson, because I remember during Ferguson, Mike Barnacle actually being outraged by the military hardware that was there, and said those aren't police officers. They look more like they're fighting a foreign war. And you were so right about Ferguson. That was obviously was the people of Ferguson that were protesting against systemic racism.
And they had gone through a proven litany of where they were over zealous in terms of giving parking tickets and fines to cover the deficit of Ferguson. This was something that had built up over a period of years. And I think that is what the president there of the local chapter is saying in Portland. That is what the community is saying. So let us not be manipulated by people that have other things that will come in and exploit the causes, and then leave us with the same racism in place, because there is a difference between a fit and a movement. We don't need to throw fits. We need to have movements, and that's what they were doing in Portland, and that's what they need to continue to do. That's why we're having this Washington March. You've got to frame it where you're dealing with legislation. You can't pass the George Floyd Policing Justice Bill or the Voting Rights Act in honor of John Lewis if we appear like we are some kind of reckless band of people that just want to burn the country down. You must show that you're better than the forces you're fighting. You don't match brute force with brute force. You match it by saying that's the brute force that we're trying to rid out of our society that has held us down.
Aaron.
Yeah, and Reverend Sharpton, who is clearly a student of the movement, understands something that, again, people like Dr. King, people like Congressman John Lewis, people like the Reverend C.T. Vivian, who's passing, we are now in the midst of celebrating and honoring those legacies. They were strategic, and they understood that anything that was a distraction from the message and from the issues that they were trying to raise to make change was hurtful to those movements. And that was certainly the case with the young protesters that I engaged with in Ferguson. I mean, to be sure, there was a lot of anger on the ground there from longstanding systemic issues. But in trying to get those issues addressed, keeping the focus on those issues meant not having scenes of things on fire, of clashes with law enforcement that seemed kind of at odds with a major American city. Those were not things that were helpful to really talking about the issues of not only police violence, but just the systemic inequality that had been running rampant in that community and was really ravaging the African American community for decades. And so I also think that what you have a media that is more aware of that long history and that context, right? And so even in covering scenes like what we've seen in Portland unfolding in these past few days, understanding that the overwhelming majority of the protests that we've seen amid this national reckoning have been peaceful. The understanding that these are protests about the need for police reform and continuing to ask about that issue and to raise awareness about that issue. And now you have, with the return of sports, you have, athletes peacefully protesting on the court. The WNBA in that opening game, you had players walking off the court as the anthem was being played. You have people who literally have Breonna Taylor's name on the back of their jersey. That is a peaceful protest that is also being seen by Americans who are tuning back into sports in this moment. So, I think that those kinds of things are helping to refocus the message away from, some of the more chaotic scenes that are seen by some as a distraction.
Sure. Aaron, thank you very, very much. And still ahead on Morning Joe, new reporting on what must happen before schools can reopen safely, even though some are reopening. Plus, top Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer will join us on where stimulus talks now stand. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Look,
To weigh in on the latter part of this distressful situation that we're being embarked upon right now by not only the American people but by the world. There wouldn't have to have been a movement in 2020 if things would have been handled.
There because they have a real different standing as back.
If things would have been handled properly in 1988, leading into the ministry becoming out into the eyes of the general public in 1989, if there would have been a support team that would have supported the ministry in the way that it interpreted the Bible and the message that it was portraying out to the general public, there wouldn't have to be a movement right now. But because of the resistance that began 30 plus years ago, and because the way that the government officials, as well as the preachers, the ministers, chose to rebel against this message, now we're having this movement. 30 years later, we're having this movement. Once more, it's all in a defiance of peace and utopia. It's all in a defiance of seeing biblical Bible prophecy come true. I've actually had people want to blame me to say, Juby, this is your fault. You caused this. That's how twisted and messed up that they are. Like, how did I do it? I'm the one that's been out here preaching the message of love and utopia and grace and forgiveness and mercy since 30 years ago. How did my message get entangled in this? That's just it. It hasn't. And they know it hasn't. But whenever you have unfair play, you're going to have people that's going to blame other people that shouldn't be getting the blame. The fact of the matter is the fault falls upon the fault. The fault falls upon the feet of those who did not want to engage into a ministry that supported wide world global peace. And now the fault and the shame should be dispersed upon to those that had an opportunity of embarking upon to the windmill ministries, but chose not to embark upon to the windmill ministries because they wanted to disclaim the windmill ministries as the windmill ministries being a fraud. They wanted to disclaim the founder of the windmill ministries as the windmill ministries founder being out of his mind because they did not like the message coming from the messenger of the windmill ministries. We know what is going on here. We know why it's going on. What's more, they didn't want the founder to take center stage. All these different churches that was hiding under the Bible and hiding under the cross that thought that this wasn't going to come full circle. And now, as of Saturday, it's coming full circle. The Neils over in Kenton. It's coming full circle with the Crosses and the Ridgeways and the Sheffields and the Halls and the Cobles and the Harrisons and the Willises and the Bakers and the Moores and the Brundridges. Now it's coming full circle. Once more, these people didn't want peace. They didn't want to support a ministry of peace. So whatever befalls up into their family, regardless whether it comes in one form or the other, they basically brought it upon to themselves. Beginning with Ronald Reagan and the Bush family. They have brought this upon to the people. And now we're going to see things unleash upon to society that are going to be absolutely sickening and disheartening. The Pharaohs really and truly thought, believing in all of their sincerity, that they was going to be able to beat Moses and Moses' God. The Pharaohs had been bought into this ideal that Moses was a madman and that Moses could be brought down. Ultimately, in the end, we see that the Pharaohs was wrong. Ultimately, in the end, we're going to see where this community around here that objected this message was wrong. The Pharaohs had to be proven. And I guess that's exactly what it's going to take for this next generation living in the 21st century before they're going to retaliate against this type of resistance movement of being proven that they was wrong. Once more, I did not choose this. This chose me. That's the reason why I went out before the world. I was loyal to this message. I was passionate to this message pertaining to the sword symbolizing peace on earth, the opening of the first seal, pertaining to the two witnesses, pertaining to the teachings of Christ, that as you shall see the days approaching, that no flesh shall be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days would be shortened. There's a lot of people throughout this neighborhood, in not only Weakley County and Obion County, but the surrounding counties, that are going to be held accountable for what they did not do that they know that they should have done. I'm going to repeat it one more time. For what they did not do that they know that they should have done. You can no longer sit idly by and pretend that you're just a spectator. Because now it has reached the boiling point that now you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution to the problem. There is no in between. Just like Christ said, that I'd rather you be hot or cold. If you're lukewarm, I'll spew thee out of thy mouth. These lukewarm type Christians, these lukewarm fit straddling Christians, these lukewarm set on your hand type Christians, they're going to come off of their hands one way or the other. They're either going to come off their hands in praise, or they're going to come off their hands in defeat. Because what is going on right now is decapitating the real movement that good will conquer over evil. But eventually, we will see good that will conquer over people. This message has been hijacked. And it just didn't get hijacked yesterday. It got hijacked in 1988 when 9 tapes went to the White House and it wasn't settled appropriately and efficiently the way that it should have been. That's whenever the message got hijacked. And now we're seeing the repercussions of it. The message that the messenger had then, the messenger still has today. It hasn't changed. The great I am is still sitting on the throne. He is the beginning and the end. He's the only one that's worthy to open thy seals and to loose thy seals up onto the earth. The message coming from the messenger has not changed, nor shall it change. That there is only one way and one way only that a person can be saved. And that's through the blood of Jesus Christ. And it's not just a matter of talking about it, but it's a matter of walking about it and actually living it and experiencing it. In other words, you have to be dedicated to cross some of them bridges that you know are not the bridge that you wanted to cross. If these people around here had their way, especially with Tommy Moore, the judge here, and Mike Wilson, and other law enforcement agencies throughout this area, if they had their way, they would either have Juby dead, and I'm not talking about metaphorically, or they would have him locked up in prison or locked up in an insane asylum for the rest of his life. Beginning with the kneels over in Kenton, Tennessee, and the crosses. If they had their way about it. So now things is escalating. Now things is getting out of control. So now let's go back to the Neal family. What's your solution to the problem, Neals? What's your solution to the problem, Crosses? What's your solution to the problem, Mr. Brundridge? Mayor Brundridge over in Martin, Tennessee? What's your solution to the problem, Tommy Moore? An ex-Moore that used to be the chief of police over in Martin, Tennessee, the captain? What's your solution to the problem? All these preachers that wanted to denounce me and put me in the same category as the Unabomber? This is sickening. And there's no manifestos being written or ordered or proclaimed. The only manifesto is coming from the Heavenly Father that tells us that it is not a suggestion but a requirement for all of us to get along. That's the only manifesto, called the Ten Commandments. And it for darn sure didn't come from Juby, the person that's talking to you right now. This violence is all senseless. It could have all been avoided. People should be spending their time and their energy on positive, productive things rather than wanting to tear up and blow up and screw up people's lives. All of this could have been eliminated if it would have been handled properly on the front end going 30 plus years ago. So now, let's see you cover up your shame. The Neals and the Crosses. The Ridgeways and the Sheffields and the Harrisons and the rest of you around here. Let's see you cover up your shame. Let's see you announce insanity, please. Well, I didn't know. Well, I didn't know. Oh, yeah, you knew. You knew by sitting back watching somebody forfeit their liberty and dedicating as much time and energy as I did. You knew that I was sincere. And you knew that the message was sincere. But you didn't want to accept the message. Just like they didn't want to accept Jesus Christ. Because if they would have accepted him, they for darn sure wouldn't have never executed him. And that's basically just exactly what I have been going through here since I moved back here since 2014, I've been going through a spiritual, physical, emotional execution. The only thing that they didn't go ahead and do is put a bullet in me or a stake in my heart towards actually killing me. And it would have been a whole lot more simpler and a whole lot more less painfuler if they would have had. And I'll tell that to any prosecuting attorney. It doesn't matter if it's in Weakley County. It doesn't matter if it's in Trigg County, Kentucky. It doesn't matter if it's in Paducah, Kentucky. It doesn't matter if it's in Atlanta, Georgia. It doesn't matter if it's in Nashville, Tennessee, or Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I'll tell that to any of them, that it would have been a whole lot more easier and simpler if they would have just went ahead and buried me, rather than me sit back and have to go through what I went through, and now I'm watching this explode. I'm watching this explode into the eyes of society, which is going to bring more scarring, more grief, more sorrow, more horror, more injustice. Where have we went wrong? I'm telling you where you went wrong. Once more, I'm the messenger. And you're not going to like this message, because I'm not sugarcoating it like Joe Osteen. I'm not going around telling you what I want to tell you, because there's really no other way for me to tell you what I'm telling you other than for me to tell you what I'm telling you. And to be quite honest with you, you don't deserve for the message to be sugar-coated. Whenever you have people that's becoming crippled, mutated, they're becoming harmed and hurt, and some of them even dead, you don't deserve for somebody to sugarcoat the message. Well, we didn't like the messenger. Right? And neither nor do I like to cut my grass whenever it's 100 degrees outside. But that doesn't mean I'm going to grab up a John Deere tractor with a breaking plow and break it all under because I don't like it. These people have been spoiled. They're used to getting their ways, and they're used to getting their corrupt ways. Well, no longer are you going to get your corrupt ways. Neal family, Cross family, Harrison family, Cobles, Willis's, Bakers, Whites, Ridgeway, Sheffields. You're no longer going to get it your way. You're going to sit and watch people, innocent lives, be destroyed on your TV sets on a day-to-day, everyday level. Now, how much longer do you want people to sit there and tell you that you screwed up? You didn't want peace. You wanted to drive the peacemaker off into the ground. You wanted to destroy the peacemaker. You didn't. It's one thing for you not to want to not support the peacemaker, and it's another thing to actually attack the peacemaker. And those are proofs in the pudding towards what went on since I come back here in 2014. Whenever I come back here to Northwest Tennessee in 2014, total hell broke out in my life. I've been through some hellish situations out in Oklahoma. I've been through some hellish situations out in Kentucky. I've been through some hellish situations up in Nashville whenever I was living in Knoxville. I've been through some hellish situations out in Atlanta, Georgia. But I've never been through hell like I've went through since I've moved back here in 2014. And we want all the locals around here to sit back and snigger and laugh and be entertained towards what they see on TV, because it's coming near a neighborhood near you. And that includes the possum. That includes Mr. Petty. I've never seen so much sickness than to wake up Monday morning, July, what is it? July the 26th, 27th, 28th, something like that. The latter part of July in 2020, to wake up and see this type of destruction. And it's not just in one town, and it's not just in one city, and it's not just in one state, but it's growing, it's intensifying, and it's getting worse. And if it's not coming in one form, it's coming in another form towards people not having jobs, or being laid off, or they're sick, or a loved one has died. Or you go to the store and the products that you used to always see on the shelf are no longer on the shelf, and now you're having to make arrangements towards, well, I really didn't like this brand, but I'm going to go to this brand. You're already having to make decisions now about all of this that you wasn't having to make 4 or 5 months ago before all this broke out. Substituting one product for another. Or what are you going to do whenever all the products is gone and there's nothing on the shelves? Nothing. The shelves are bare. Then who are you going to cry out to? Then who are you going to blame? Are you still going to blame the messenger? The messenger that started out 30 plus years ago with the same message? Just as Adam blamed Eve, just as Eve blamed the devil, the human race holds the same characteristics today as they did going all the way back to the beginning of time. Well, it's not my fault. I didn't cause it. I didn't do it. It's not my fault. People wanting to be held unaccountable. One day I will stand in front of a throne, a great throne. And some of the people that has engaged and embarked upon my life will begin with the Reagans and the Bushes on a federal level. Then it will go down to a state level pertaining to the very governor that was elected from the Weakley County District that now holds a statue up in Dresden, Tennessee. I will go from federal to state down to the local level of those who embarked upon to this ministry, that laughed, that sniggered, that not only didn't care, that didn't support the ministry, but actually either attacked the ministry directly or indirectly, sat back and allowed for the ministry to be attacked. Either or. They are going to be people that are going to stand in the clinches of guilt, of the shame falling upon the feet of those that created this. That created this. Because this is just the very opposite of peace and utopia. Love, mercy, and grace. And we're just now getting into the beginning phases of this. Just like the coronavirus. This is just the beginning phases of all this. This is the aftermath. This is the carnage that follows after something like this. This is the collateral damage. This is the work of Satan. Lashing out, just like the Bible talks about, in the last days of great wrath, because he knoweth his time is short. Good luck to all of us. Good luck to each and every one of us. And as the scripture says, to pray that we can either endure these things or pray that we will escape these things. Good luck to each and every one of us in these enduring moments of seeing horror and clashes be brought out to society in such of a horrible, horrible, horrible way. That right there is either stupidity or blind, senseless judgment.